All right, so we welcome everybody to today's track call. We have a great topic today of OURRstore, big data on a small budget. Henry Neiman and Patrick Calhoun from OU are going to lead our presentation today. We kind of invite everybody to keep themselves muted unless they're asking questions. We'll kind of ask Patrick and Henry to kind of indicate how they'd like us to ask questions, whether they want us to throw them out as we go or kind of hold to question and answer times.
All the time.
Right.
Yes, we love questions. Ask them when they pop into your head. Don't wait.
But if you'd like to ask them via the chat, Troy and I will kind of help try to monitor the chat and make sure Patrick and Henry are aware that the questions were thrown out in chat. Please join us on the Google Doc, help us keep notes, capture the questions and answers that were brought up in the conversation, and we'll turn the time over to Patrick and Henry, and we kind of have until just a few minutes before the top of the hour. And let me go ahead and stop my share so you guys can take over.
Thank you so much. And let me turn on my share. And I'm going to drive the slides here. I'll put myself into presentation mode. And I see there's already a chat. Let's see if it's anything that I need to worry about. Oh man, never mind. All right, you guys probably have to drive the chat part. Give me a second. It's always one thing or another. Okay. All right, so we're going to be talking about the OU and Regional Research Store, or OURRstore. I'm Henry Neiman, and also here is Patrick Calhoun. We're from the University of Oklahoma, from the OU Supercomputing Center for Education and Research. We have too many slides, so we're just going to chug along until we run out of time, and I'll leave it to Brian and Troy to alert us when we're running out of time. And ask questions as we go. Don't be shy, because if you wait to the end, we probably ran out of time. This is just sort of a one-pager to kind of summarize the thing, but since we're going to go through this, let's just leap forward. We're going to give a little background, a little history, and then we'll talk about long-term archival storage and why it's difficult to do, and we'll map that to how researchers behave in their native habitat and what their point of view is on things. We'll show you a business model. I'm going to skip over the bit about the friction-free network. It's not really core to this discussion, but we'll get right into the architecture, the technology approach that we're using. And then time permitting, we can talk about some features and some other fun stuff. And don't be shy. Dive right in at any time by chat or by voice. We love you and we want to hear from you and make it a conversation. So here's the history. Failure, 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 success. That's how I would characterize this. Way back in 2015, in the distant mists of time, we submitted a proposal to the National Science Foundation's Data Infrastructure Building Blocks program, which that year uniquely was part of the Campus Cyber Infrastructure program. It was $5 million for 2 large-scale archives, one at OU, one at University of Arkansas. And it was, I'm not sure it was literally the worst reviews I've ever gotten in my life, but it was essentially an F+ average on the reviews. So just hideous, hideous reviews. And they were brutal. These folks did not hold back at all. The next year we submitted it to the NSF Major Research Instrumentation Program, which was a much better fit. And we managed to pull out a C average on the reviews that time, which was still not very good. Then in 2017, we got it up to a B average. And finally in 2018, we got it to an A or an A- average. So not too bad. We got funded for just under $1 million. All right, so let's talk about why research data management is hard. So let's say I've got tens or hundreds of terabytes or petabytes or exabytes. It's coming up, it's coming up. So why can't I just go to Walmart or Costco or wherever and buy myself a big crate of USB drives and just fill them up with my data? Why can't I? Because that's going to be cheap, right? I think that comes in around $20 a terabyte. That's not bad. I've got some numbers coming up. And, I was actually at a workshop some years ago called Research Data Lifecycle Management, where there were CIOs and VPs of research, and the VPs of research asked exactly this question. Why can't we just go to Walmart? And the answer is the same as why you don't enter a NASCAR race on a riding lawnmower. You can do it, but you probably are not going to win, and most likely you will get killed. Just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you should do that thing. So to put it in more concrete terms, and by the way, I didn't take time over the last couple of days to look up the more recent numbers because they probably haven't changed that much. So the data I have here on pricing is from about 3 months ago. USB drives are cheap. The cheapest per terabyte is 8 terabyte drives. They're running about $20 per usable terabyte. Of course, you don't want just a single copy of your files, so you buy 2 of them. So now you got a secondary copy. If you buy a lot of them at a time, you can get out from under paying indirect costs, paying overhead on them. But if you're buying them in chunks of under $5,000 a piece, you're going to be paying indirect on top of that. At most institutions, that's on the order of 50% upcharge for the purchase. You know, once you get into tens of terabytes, you're probably not going to want that strategy anymore because, and I've actually talked to people who have this, once you have a cardboard box full of USB drives with little Dyna labels on them, boy, when you're looking for one particular file, it is awfully hard to find it. On top of that, after a few years, you start to not want to ever plug that drive into the USB port anyway, because you're worried that the first thing you're going to hear is that beautiful chunka noise that means that all your files are gone. So if you can avoid checking whether your files are there, you can pretend they haven't been destroyed yet. So, you know, beyond a few tens of terabytes, you're going to want to start doing something like a cheap RAID enclosure or something like that. You're going to want to make sure you do like RAID 6. You know, we've had people at OU who did RAID 5 and regretted it because they lost 2 drives at the same time, which is actually surprisingly high probability. And so, you know, now when you get into a RAID system, your prices are going way up, right? So the cheapest place I know of, and I am not advocating for them, it's just the cheapest one I happen to know about, is 45drives.com. They'll do 60 by 16 terabytes, comes out to a little over $50 per usable terabyte. If you go with Dell, you're looking at almost twice that, right? And you know, even the cheaper one of those is 2.5 times what the USB is. But now, of course, you've got to have much more expertise, you know, like the folks on this call would have. And the risk is higher because if something goes wrong, you're going to lose a lot of data, right? So now you have to buy 2, and of course, you could double your costs. And you don't want to keep it in production forever. So, you know, 5 years from now, you're going to buy another pair of them, and so on. Now, of course, the price will come down, but I got some words about that too. If you go to enterprise class, and this, by the way, is fairly low-end enterprise class, and again, I'm not picking this one because I'm advocating for it, but because I happen to have experience with pricing these out, so I know what components to put in there. MSRP is coming in at $350K, and that's about $146 per usable terabyte per copy. By the way, they changed the name of this now, but let's not worry about it. That doesn't include servers, doesn't include switches. Of course, you got to double it for the dual copies, and then 5 years later, you got to buy it again, and on and on and on and on and on. Of course, now you're talking about an enterprise system. You got to have a proper data center, space, power, cooling, labor, fire suppression, on and on and on and on, right? I mean, our bread and butter, but from the perspective of a researcher, they're not really thinking about this stuff. So what this boils down to is disk is expensive. It's just as simple as that. Okay, well, why don't we just dump our stuff in the commercial cloud? You know, they've got archiving systems up there. Why can't we just do that? And you totally can, right? The cheapest of those is Azure Blob Archive. And it's actually not 1/10 of a penny. It's 0.99 hundredths of a penny. So it's just under 1/10 of a penny per gigabyte per month. If we were to assume that the price per terabyte would come down by a factor of 2 every 2 years, the traditional Moore's law, then that would be $57 per terabyte over an 8-year period. But that's not how it works in real life anymore. And I've got some slides, some data coming up about that. Now it's more like $84 per terabyte, okay? It gets more expensive as you go to the other ones. They all keep multiple copies. So you're doing great, but then here's the problem. What do you do if you're a researcher and you've got a 3-year grant? You know, the problem with a recurring cost storage strategy is in month 47, when you can no longer pay the bill, they will cheerfully delete all your data for you. So, well, could you put that on your next grant? Well, you could, but there's two problems with that. The first is, how do you know that you will have a next grant already positioned by the time you run out of this grant? Now, okay, if you're at a top 10 institution, maybe even a top 50, okay, yeah, you always have money, you're fine. But if you're not at a top 50 institution, and by the way, the problem with the top 50 is there's only 50 of them. If you're not at a top 50 institution, you can't guarantee that you'll have a new pot of money. And on top of that, even if you do have a new pot of money, even if you're at a top 50 institution, if you've got a new pot of money, there's no guarantee that you're allowed to spend that money on your old data, because the new project may not have anything to do, may not need the old data, in which case, how the heck do you justify spending new money on old data, right? So you really want something where you can make a purchase during the life of the grant, but it lasts well beyond the life of the grant. And in fact, both the NSF and the National Institutes of Health, when they give you a grant, they expect you to have a data management plan that says how you're going to make sure the data is not only existing, but is available to people outside of your institution at no more than incremental cost, which to first order means free. And they usually don't specify how long that needs to be. And no one will say the following, but the following is where we're headed. We'll never get there, but we'll always be expected to get closer and closer to it. Every bit, everywhere, on every platform, forever, for free. Now again, not literally that, we're not there, but that's effectively where we're headed. And any data management strategy you have needs to start from that and work its way backwards to what's practical, not start from what's practical. So you need to think about what's the long term for keeping your data. So here is a way of looking at pricing a petabyte, at least dual copies, for at least 8 years, right? So the low-end enterprise disk approach for that is almost $1 million. A RAID system is to $250,000. Putting it in the cloud is almost $100K. USB drives is $60K. We'll put it on our store for less than $24K. Okay, and I'll get to that in a moment, how we do that. And here we're assuming dual copies. Some of these have indirect costs on them. If it's not permanent equipment at above $5,000, you have to pay indirect costs on it. And if you're buying equipment, you have to buy equipment twice because you don't want to run the equipment for 8 years, not when you have mission critical data on it. Okay, and we'll get into the details of that. Fixed costs for tape, by the way, are enormous. But that's an advantage if you can get that covered. This is why we got the NSF grant to cover the fixed costs. And actually the number here, 72%, is actually too low because I left out some components. So it's probably more like 80% of the total cost of OURRstore is fixed costs, things we'd have to buy before we even worried about how many tape cartridge slots we had. Okay. Well, what about Moore's Law? Isn't that going to help? No, and in two directions. By the way, I saw that there were some chats. Were there any questions in the chats?
Not yet.
Okay, great. For some reason, I can't make the chat window pop up on my laptop here. Okay, so won't Moore's Law save you? Well, no. First of all, because your data is going to grow faster than Moore's Law for storage. You know, we know that computing speed and capacity doubles every 24 months. And by the way, you know, people say we're getting up to the wall on this, but I looked at this as of, I think it was Skylake. And from, I think it was from, what was the one before Westmere? From Nehalem to Skylake, Moore's Law was almost perfectly correct. Had remained so during that whole period. So I still believe in Moore's Law for compute, right? Next generation sequencing, if you're doing that, you're improving by a factor of 10 every 16 months. I used to tell the next generation sequencing people, don't bother buying storage, just buy freezers, because it'll be cheaper to resample your samples, your biological stuff, your goop, than to store the data. I learned, though, when I gave that talk to a group of bioinformatics folks, the problem they have is each time some of them, each time they run a new experiment, they have to compare it to all the previous experiments. So they can't throw away the data. So they're like double secret screwed. Okay, but here's another reason why Moore's law is not going to help. Because the Moore's law for spinning disk, which is the only disk you can afford at scale, the Moore's law for spinning disk is improving glacially slowly. Now, I have slightly good news, because the going from 8 terabyte drives to 16 terabyte drives took 58 months. The good news is going from 10 terabyte drives to 20 terabyte drives took a mere 54 months. However, I strongly suspect that that's just pure dumb luck. And the 24s versus the 12s is going to revert to closer to 5 years than 4. Anyway, so it used to be that disk drive prices improved very, very rapidly. Now they improve glacially slowly. Tape, on the other hand, is pretty steady at doubling the capacity per dollar about every 2.5 years. That's been pretty consistent. And I'm thinking specifically of the LTO format family. The other nice thing with tape is that the areal density on tape is about 1% of where it is on disk, meaning there's a lot more headroom to grow with tape than there is with disk. And I don't know if anybody has heard beyond this. I have heard that they know how to make 60 terabyte spinning drives. I have not yet heard a number above 60. Likewise, I've heard they know how to make 64 or 60 or something terabyte SSDs, although they're not on the market. The 30s are. I have not heard that they know how to make above 60, although I strongly suspect with SSDs, getting above 60 will be more straightforward than with spinning. And, you know, in calendar 2018, SSD prices dropped by a factor of 2. Well, I went to the same webpage just, 20 minutes ago, just out of curiosity, and it looks like SSD prices have hardly changed at all in the last 18 months. So they're making up for the fact that they had a big drop 2 years ago. And that big drop was caused by there wasn't enough demand. They had overproduced. That's not going to happen on a basis that we can really count on. And I came up with, for SSD, $1 million per petabyte, if we're lucky. Okay, let's talk about researchers and how they behave and the psychology of researchers. Here's the thing. Researchers like to hug their toys, and the reason is they don't trust other people. And a big part of that's driven by 2 things. One is they know they're on their own. If the administration does not help them do the work that they need to do, the administration is not going to take responsibility for their failures. If the administration impedes their work, same thing. So they become very self-reliant. They are not interested in what they consider to be interference by the administration. And they certainly do not trust the administration to serve each individual research team's needs well, because the university tends to look at the needs of the institution as a whole, sort of on average, rather than specific quirky needs of an individual research team. And, they may have a very dim view of the administration because of either their own negative experiences or what they've heard from colleagues. Certainly, researchers trust the word of their colleagues a lot more than they trust the word of the administration. Then researchers think of roll your own as cheaper, right, than something that's centrally managed. It can actually be more expensive and still seem cheaper because some of the costs are sort of invisible. Space, power, and cooling, for example. I remember we had a faculty member who put, I think it was an 8 or 16 node cluster back when things ran pretty hot, in one of their labs. And one of his team members literally passed out from the heat and fell down in front, I'm not making this up, in front of me. He fell to the floor in a dead faint from the heat. So I would consider that a cost. Labor, you all know this better than anybody. It takes a significant amount of expertise to do this properly. The maintenance on an ongoing basis is not cheap, especially after your initial warranty expires. But researchers think of it as cheaper to roll their own, and they've got to stretch those funds as far as they can. Now, the classic data management strategy is you have a grad student who generates some data. It lives on the sole hard drive in the PC under that grad student's desk. And when they graduate, that data is effectively gone in the sense that, you know, the faculty member doesn't even have a login on that PC. Or even if they do, they don't know where the data is stored. They don't know what format it's stored in. They don't know what the file name conventions are, nothing, right? Because that's not something that would have come up. And then the grad student goes off and, you know, they go to industry or whatever, and they lose touch, right? That's a little bit less of an issue nowadays because of LinkedIn and Facebook. I'm surprised how many former OU grad students I know via LinkedIn and Facebook, but it's still quite common. So the data might as well not exist. And because it just lives on the one hard drive, it's probably never backed up. Or, as I mentioned before, you can have the cardboard box full of USB drives, right? Good luck finding anything. So why is it this way? You know, I've already talked about the perception issue. There's a mindset issue. There's a mindset gap, right? We live in a world of Linux, command line, shared, remote, batch. And they live in a world of handheld. You know, we used to say that our typical new user came to us from a Windows desktop background, but that was like 10 years ago. That was like the good old golden years, right? Nowadays, they're coming from Android and iOS. And their perception, their mindset of how computing is completely the upside down of the reality of the large scale. And, you know, to give a very typical example, if on my phone, if I want to double my storage, I got two strategies. I can buy a new phone, or if it's got an SD slot in it, I can buy a little card and pop in the card. And literally, right, I'm paying like 20, 50, I mean, under $100. I'm paying two figures for that card, and I'm sticking it in the slot. I stick it in the slot until it clicks, and then seconds later, I have that storage available. The whole process takes maybe an hour, including going to the store, like driving to and from the store, right? Anybody who's been through a storage procurement knows that's not how it works at our scale, not even close, right? Cost, well, you know, grad students are cheap, and faculty think, well, I can have my grad students run this, and they don't think about meaning they will produce fewer papers per year. They think about meaning I won't have to pay anybody to run it because I'm already paying my grad students to be my grad students. But the real driver of this, especially from the faculty perspective at academic institutions, faculty have incentives that are based on essentially three things: bringing in grant money, publishing papers, and graduating students. In fact, if you're at a non-research intensive institution, bringing in grant money probably isn't even one of those. And anything else they do, like, you know, having good computing, they will be effectively punished for in the sense that they won't get the rewards associated with bringing in grant money, publishing papers, and graduating students. So they don't want to put any more than the absolute minimum amount into anything they will not be rewarded for, because they are, this should be shocking, normal human beings. Okay, so how do we address that? One thing that we've done is distribute the costs among multiple entities so that nobody has to eat the whole thing, right? And then it's affordable for everyone. So everybody is subsidizing everybody else in some sense. And then find ways to leverage that funding to get other funding, right? So here's our business model. We did this first on the PetaStore, which is sort of in its last months before we put OURRstore into production. And now we're doing this with OURRstore. So we got a grant from the National Science Foundation, covers hardware, software, and the initial warranties on everything. Then our CIO provides the data center, so space, power, and cooling, provides labor, and Patrick leads that, and he'll be talking about the technical side of it, and then pays the maintenance after the initial warranty expires. And then the researchers just buy tape cartridges. So that makes it a lot cheaper for the researchers, and it makes it cheaper for everybody, right? The NSF, they just pay for the machine, which they normally do on MRIs anyway. They're used to that. These are regular grants. It's normal. The institution, the space and the labor, and to a significant extent, the cooling, is a fixed cost. With labor, the way that we do it is we prioritize, right? So we decide this is important and that's less important. We're going to do this first. Now, we do hope over time we get to grow our team, and historically that has been true. But within the moment, in the current fiscal year, we do it based on prioritization. And then, so the real sort of obvious cash cost that they can point to on their books is they're paying the maintenance. And then the researchers, it is way cheaper to buy tape cartridges than anything else, including USB drives from Walmart. And the great thing is, tape cartridges are better in every way except the one they care about. Okay, it's cheaper. Well, that's one of the ways they care about it. It's cheaper. It's more reliable. The bit rate is, at worst, 10% as much as on disk, and at best, less than 1%. It's less labor for the users to use it because they can treat it as just a big file system. It requires less expertise for the researchers to use. We do a 1-hour training. But it is massively slower, not in bandwidth, but in latency. It is slower in bandwidth too, but the real issue is latency. So instead of a 1 to 10 millisecond seek as you would have on disk, it's a 1 minute seek on tape. All right, so you distribute the costs among the agency, the institution, and the researchers. It's archive, it's not live storage, so write once, read seldom, if ever, or the acronym is WORSE. That's lovely. It's independent and standalone. The grants pay for the tape cartridge slots instead of the tape cartridges. We make those slots available first come, first serve. There's some give on that because we put emphasis on the OU folks. I'll get to that. Software costs are a very modest fraction of the total. We actually drove the cost way down this time by finding a hidden caveat in a document on the IBM website that they don't like to advertise, but we discovered it. You want to maximize the longevity of the media. We're using Globus, not just for file transfers, but for file sharing. And we're using LTFS, which puts a little tiny file catalog at the beginning of each tape cartridge. What we do is we ship the secondary copies of the files back to the data owner. So even if we were to burn to the ground, which we won't, but even if something horrible were to happen here, they spend $3K to get themselves an LTO tape drive and use free software, and they can get at all of their files. They have a copy of their data at home. So no matter what happens at OU, they can still get their data. Not necessarily conveniently, but it's straightforward. So these are the grants. We had one for the PetaStore, our current system that's about to go out of production, and for the new one, OURRstore.
Henry, there's a couple of questions.
Please. Let's hear them.
So the first one is, how is the CIO convinced to provide and absorb the additional costs of maintenance and labor?
Right. So there's an enormous amount, well, and I should say historically, this goes back 3 CIOs, because this was in 2010 when we first got the PetaStore grant. And the CIOs since then have all understood the value of it because they all worked for each previous CIO, and so they've seen the value of it. So we didn't have to convince the current CIO. We had to convince the first CIO. And because he himself had been a faculty member and a researcher, he was, I think, a physical chemist or a chemical physicist, I can't remember which. It wasn't that hard to convince him. He already knew about the Major Research Instrumentation Program. He knew about the cost share requirement for it. It was pretty straightforward to convince him. And everybody since then has learned as they went along that it's a valuable thing. So there wasn't a lot of convincing involved. That was a great question. What's the next one?
So there's a little bit more to that one. Is the CIO office getting something off the top from grant money that is being brought in?
It depends what you mean by that. So it's getting OURRstore. and before that, the PetaStore. So in that sense, yes, that is, our group is part of central IT, and so all of the accomplishments associated with first the PetaStore project and now the OURRstore project are credited to OUIT. So to make that very concrete, in the proposal that got funded for OURRstore in 2018, we referenced, I think it was 146 publications that were facilitated by the PetaStore. And that was, again, now 2.5 years ago. So you can imagine the number now is like over 200. So yes, it's very, very easy. If the central IT organization likes providing value to the university's research mission, and ours does, and has historically done so, going all the way back to 2001. If that's something that the central IT organization values, this is a great way to accomplish it. And the cost is relatively modest. So we're paying, let's say, mid 5 figures per year on the maintenance, and the labor. Patrick, I think we agreed it was somewhere in the 1/8 to 1/10 of your time is spent on maintaining the PetaStore. Is that right?
It's going lower and lower every year. At this point, I'd say it's 2.5% of an FTE.
Okay. So the labor part is not excessive, and it gave us the ability to add Patrick to the team, to add a new team member. So everybody won. It really was not hard to convince the first CIO, and since then the other CIOs, having grown up under each preceding CIO, have understood the value of the thing.
You know, it's interesting. There's a couple of follow-up questions that dovetail on that.
Yeah.
One of them is there a cost model to support the staff FTE? But then, especially under current conditions, the distribution of tape copies seems like it would be problematic. How often do you need to extract tapes and give them to researchers? And I think my comment on that is with OURRstore, it's a lot more complicated.
Yeah, so under the PetaStore, because the PetaStore was only for Oklahoma institutions and is almost entirely OU, there's some Oklahoma State and there's one guy at East Central University, and that's about it. There's a couple other organizations, but almost all of it is OU. So all we did was we keep our secondary copies of everything, even the few non-OU users, on campus, and that's not a big deal. But with OURRstore, where we're going to have, I think we're starting at 24 or 25 institutions in 16 states. With OURRstore, well, here it is. It's 27 institutions in 17 states, excuse me. We just couldn't afford to do it that way anymore. And so the secondary copies thing, the advantage of the secondary copies approach is a user has assurance that they've got access to their data no matter what happens at OU. The disadvantage is we have to come up with good strategies for when to send them their secondary copy, because of course the ideal would be fill up the tape cartridge and then ship it, not send them a half-populated tape cartridge. But if they're only generating data slowly, then that might be a long time before they get their secondary copy. We also have to work out the technology strategy for how to handle that effectively. And there's a significant number of unknowns. We haven't worked out all the details because right now we're learning the software technology. And when I say we, I really mean Patrick. I'm not learning it at all. But
speaking of software, we skipped a question. Was the software package that should be a fraction of the cost mentioned?
Oh, so we will mention it shortly. Patrick's going to cover that.
Okay.
Good. Anyway, so who's eligible to use the new one, OURRstore? If you are at any non-commercial research or education institution in any EPSCoR jurisdiction, and they're listed in the second bullet point in the fine print here, then you are automatically eligible. If you're not in an EPSCoR jurisdiction, you can buy an expansion cabinet and then you can fill that up with your data. You have to buy the cartridges as well. The real disadvantage of that is we only have room in the data center for 2 more. And so there's very limited ability for non-EPSCoR researchers to get to buy into this. As I mentioned, lots of research teams at lots of institutions in lots of states. Our goal is to get to all 28 of the EPSCoR jurisdictions. I predict that the last of those will be Guam, in large part because Guam has a master's granting university but no PhD granting university. So the amount of data that they're in a position to generate based on the kind of research funding they get is presumably significantly smaller. And we have this time 16 teams that need at least a petabyte each. That compares to, for the PetaStore project, we had 12 teams total, and none of them needed a petabyte. Okay, so what's the need? We added it all up, 134 petabytes, which is about 17,500 of the current generation of tape cartridges. But of course, this is an 8-year system, an 8-year project. So we should be able to fit it into probably the 11,000 that we're buying now, 11,000 slots that we're buying now. If not, we have room to grow, as mentioned. We can grow to about 16,000 slots, give or take, in the data center space we have. So what would that cost? Well, it's a mere 3 million in tape cartridges if we bought it all today, right? That number will go down as later versions of LTO with bigger capacities become available. If we were to buy it today in USB drives, it'd be 8 million. If we did it as on-premise disk, it'd be 31 million. Huge amount of money, just unreal. These projects collectively have over $100 million of active funding and over $100 million of planned and pending funding. It's over 250 faculty. It's over 1,000 students who the researchers on the project, on the proposal, told us they expect would be using it either to store data or to retrieve data. Okay, but everybody hates tape, right? Which, by the way, is true. Everybody does hate tape, except the people who sell it. They love tape. But, you know, tape is terrible, but it's terrible in the way that democracy and old age are terrible. It sucks except compared to the alternative. So the wonderful thing about tape, and perhaps the only really wonderful thing about tape, is it's so cheap. It's terrible in the sense of it takes a long time to retrieve any file. And of course, tape cartridges can break. We had that happen. We had it happen literally right before Christmas. And so we were joking about, yeah, so now we have some extra tinsel, right? And that's what it becomes when the cartridge breaks, is it's basically tinsel at that point. So how do we resolve the latency problem? Well, we'll only store big files. That way, at least it's worth the trouble of downloading it, right? If you store a 1 megabyte file and it takes 1 minute to start reading it and a fraction of a second, it's literally a fraction of a second, to actually read it from tape, that's a pointless waste of that minute, right? So we say the minimum you can store is a gigabyte, and the maximum you can store is 1/10, 10% of the capacity, the raw capacity of the cartridge. So with LTO-7 type M, that would be 900 gig. You know, we might round up a little bit and say a terabyte. That's probably easier for people to remember, but we're not there yet, right? And it's offline storage. So if you want to use the data, you need to download it to disk that can be used live for your number crunching. And you have to learn to think hierarchically, right? You have a little bit of, let's say, flash, a medium amount of spinning disk, and a lot of tape. That's the way to do it, right? And then there's investment protection. What we're doing now is when we get to OURRstore, when we get OURRstore into production, we're going to put the PetaStore into read-only mode, and we're going to copy all the files on the PetaStore over to OURRstore. We actually bought enough tape cartridges for OURRstore to cover the entire capacity of all the tape cartridges that any of our users bought for the PetaStore. So they don't have to buy a second time. And we can't guarantee what's going to happen 8 years from now with the successor to OURRstore, but certainly our goal is the same thing again, that all of the files that are on OURRstore, we buy enough tape cartridge capacity to cover them for the next thing. That won't be cheap, by the way, but cheaper than the alternative.
So there are a couple more questions got thrown out.
Yeah.
So,
Questions?
Yep. The first one what will the researchers need special software to extract the data off their tape copy if they have to do it without OU?
So yes, and it's free and downloadable. IBM, I think, provides it as LTFS. What's the term? It's not library edition. It's, I don't know, standard edition or something. Patrick, you might know.
I actually don't remember what they branded that as.
Yeah.
I don't think that the software is so much the barrier, though.
No. You have to buy the tape drive and a little USB enclosure for it. That's really the barriers. You know, you got to have 3K, basically.
Yeah. So one thing that we don't know for sure is the actual written format of the data, even within LTFS. We don't have a guarantee that it's legible, so to speak, by a standard software. So there may be an extra step that we have to take at exporting, if that's the case, where we ensure that the data is readable in a non-proprietary format within LTFS.
Right. And I'm realizing we're down to our last 15 minutes and we haven't even gotten to the meaty stuff. So I'm going to jump ahead, and Patrick, you just say next slide when you're ready to go. This is your part.
Actually, right before the meaty stuff, there was one more question.
Okay.
What was the method of capturing storage requirements for researchers per project? Is it part of the proposal submission process?
Yeah, so what we did was we asked them. And we asked them not only how much do you expect to need over the coming 8 years, but how did you calculate that? And in many cases, they really didn't have a good way to calculate it. So we had to sort of walk through that with them. Some of them are very good at knowing what they need and calculating it out. In many cases, they know what they need now, but they don't have a way of guesstimating what they're going to need 8 years from now. And so we drill down into, well, how fast do you expect it to grow? Like, do you expect Moore's law, like it doubles every 2 years? Or is it going to be slower than that or faster than that? And usually if we ask the question in that way, they either would have a good answer or they'd say, well, what's the default? And we would say it double every 2 years. They're like, yeah, okay, that's probably close enough. And, you know, reviewers understand perfectly well, you know, it's the old joke, predictions are hard, especially about the future. Reviewers understand perfectly well these are best estimates based on very fuzzy understanding. You know, my usual rule of thumb is anybody who tries to make technology predictions more than 3 years out is an idiot. We were making technology predictions 8 years out. So you can judge us on that basis. Okay, Patrick, ready to steal the show?
Yeah, in fact, I'd like to try to share my screen. Are you open to stopping
Yeah,
your
sure.
share?
Let me do a stop
All right.
share.
All right.
Go ahead.
All right, I'm giving it a go. Oh yes, all sorts of stuff.
Nice.
All right. Okay, so again, feel free to interrupt me. I am not monitoring chat while I present, so just let me know if there are any questions. So I'm going to talk about the actual hardware, and unfortunately, we are in the midst of 3 system deployments right now, and I get them all confused in my head. So hopefully Henry's here to help me sort it out when you ask tough questions about numbers. Since we've all established here that we think tape is the most cost-effective solution for this problem, we're designing everything around the tape library itself. In the case of, well, you know what, I'm gonna skip down to the actual comparisons between what we did for PetaStore and what we've done to the OURRstore, and hopefully I can clarify what we've learned over the last 9 years with the PetaStore to inform those decisions. But the gist of it all is we have a tape library, and then we have all the hardware and software we need to make that library actually useful to a researcher. And again, you know, these researchers come from iOS and Android backgrounds increasingly. And so making it user-friendly has been the challenge and why we have a lot of this extra hardware and software on top. I don't have a lot to say about the network, so I'm going to talk about that first. And it's dual fiber channel 32 gig. And we haven't had any demand for any sort of bandwidth even approaching 32 gig. That just seems to be what vendors are able to provide now. So that's the least interesting part, I think. So let's talk about the tape library itself. The PetaStore was an IBM TS3500. We had capacity for 2,859 slots, and I think we're currently running around 60% full, maybe more than that if we include some of our offsites that are not currently in the library. Initially, we had 4 LTO-5 drives, and again, this was 9 years ago. Sometime in a couple of years after that, we added some LTO-6 drives, and they have the ability to read and write LTO-5 media as well. So it's kind of dictated by the cost per terabyte curve of the media when we do the upgrades and when we encourage our users to switch to buying the subsequent media flavor. And for the OURRstore system, we were open to re-outfitting the TS3500. We don't have any particular complaints about it, but the TS4500 pricing and capacity gave us the ability to have 11,000 tape slots at the beginning. And we'll, as Henry said, we have room to add a couple of more expansion cabinets if that's needed. And we expect that it very well may be over the 8-year grant lifetime. So we're starting with 6 LTO-8 tape drives, but based on media prices, we're encouraging our scientists to purchase the LTO-7 media, and we're formatting it as type M. And I don't exactly understand why type M occurred, but we have guessed that the chemistry change between LTO-6 and 7 has allowed this higher areal density of data with LTO-7 media. So to support the tape system, we have a staging area for data on disk. And on the PetaStore, we anticipated a much larger need for staging area. And we had allowed for archiving on spinning disk on the original PetaStore system as one of our primary offerings. So the original PetaStore system was an IBM DCS 9900. It's a very large cabinet. In fact, we had a dual dual rack scenario. And so it had a capacity for, I think it was 1,200 disk drive slots. And we initially populated it with 300 2 terabyte disk drives. And it's essentially a RAID 6 type system in terms of how much of that capacity is used up by the formatting. And we deployed it, I'm skipping ahead. I'm gonna try not to do that. So over time, we allowed researchers to buy packs of disk drives in sets of 10 and add that to the DCS 9900 system until there was one day, not very long into the project, when our vendor said, we're no longer selling disk drives for this system. And so we were left with this large footprint that was less than 50% populated. And one thing that we ended up doing as well, since we're never going to populate it, we ended up taking half of the system off of maintenance and consolidating all of the disk drives into one cabinet. So anyway, we've got a very different approach on OURRstore, and we're using the IBM Flash System 5030, which is actually very similar to the one Henry was talking about, the V5010E, and now it's called Flash System, which confusingly has nothing to do with flash storage, at least not in our case. And so what this is a smaller cabinet, and it's expandable. And so we're starting off with 48 disk drive slots, and we can, with just the 2 controllers that come with it, we can add up to 92. We can have a few hundred drives, 12 or 92 at a time, depending on how many are being purchased at a time by the researchers. And then we have the ability to add separate disk subsystems if for some reason that demand occurs, because we're using GPFS, and so we can have new systems added trivially.
Just a quick comment we have about 5 minutes left before we should tie up.
Okay, I will try to gloss over a whole bunch so that we'll have a little time for questions then. So we were using GPFS and TSM. I believe TSM is the software that we found the discount on. Is that right, Henry?
Well, we did get somewhat of a discount. The real issue was that TSM and GPFS were charged per server, or actually per socket or something along those lines. They were not charged based on the number of tape cartridge slots or the amount of tape capacity. All the other vendor software solutions were charged either based on tape slots or tape capacity, and that's why they were unaffordable.
Right,
We were going to have on the almost 3,000 slots.
right.
This stuff was charged based essentially proportional to the number of servers, and since we have just so very few servers, it was mid 5 figures.
Okay. So there's not much that's changed there over the last 10 years. GPFS and TSM have both been rebranded, and we'll continue to use them based on the cost. It's not that they're necessarily the best solution, TSM in particular, it's that it's cost effective. We've done some minor changes to what we've licensed out of TSM. We've kind of honed in on how we want to approach the migration of data. And so we're actually we've kind of gone back to basics. We're using cron now, for example, instead of some of the TSM administrative schedules. And we're open to using things like systemd timers, but essentially this is a roll your own type solution that is leveraging the TSM and the Spectrum Archive now brand for the actual data transfer. So here's what we make our researchers adopt, and they get to place their files in a directory that corresponds to how safe their data is and in what type of duplication it will get. So in the PetaStore, we had a 1 copy unsafe on disk. We had disk 1 copy, tape 1 copy, tape 1 copy, unsafe, and tape 2 copies. And we make them say the name unsafe as part of the name of the directory so that they're acknowledging that they know it's only 1 copy in the system. Those will essentially be available in OURRstore as well. The disk 1 copy is unsafe is not really the focus of the system, and so we haven't really decided how that will look. We would certainly rather encourage people to use disk 1 copy, tape 1 copy, because tape is so cheap and the disk 1 footprint is so expensive relative. In addition to that, we'll add tape 3 copies as an option, in which case we will be shipping the exported copies to the non-OU users. Quick note about how this is copied to tape, terminology-wise. So a backup operation in this case is copying from disk to tape and leaving it on disk. Pre-migration is also disk to tape copy, but we're leaving it on disk for the moment. And then migration is removing it from disk after the copy. So the approach we used for each of those duplication policies was a backup for disk 1, tape 1, and a migration for tape 1, and a migration plus on the back end a tape-to-tape copy for PetaStore. On the PetaStore, we've since changed it so that we're not using the backup operation of TSM. We're using a pre-migration operation. And what that does is really uninteresting on the surface, but it consolidates the databases and the schedules for the TSM software, since it's all migration type operations and not backup type operations. Now for OURRstore, we'll continue that habit. We won't be using any backup features of the software, but we'll be using a lot more pre-migrations. So our goal is to have our tape drives free as much as possible for primary data movement. And so the tape-to-tape copy, for example, monopolizes 2 tape drives to do that copy. So there's not a whole lot of access ability for, let's say, reading data, which apparently is something the researchers want to do from time to time. So we will be doing a lot more of this one at a time sort of tape use for the multiple copies. One of the things that's coming up recently is we will be doing Globus file sharing on this system, and so that will make it easier for our researchers to share in a way that's not tedious for them, hopefully, in terms of copying first and then putting it on, say, a website. And then one thing that's on our radar here is the Oxford Common File layout. What we're talking about here is when we are archiving data for the benefit of our users in an automated fashion, how are we going to format that data in a way that is perhaps approaching archival quality? And so the Oxford Common File layout, which is about 1 week old officially, is one approach of storing metadata and checksums with your data. So that's something we're looking at for our automated processes. And yes, we will be looking at HIPAA and regulated data for OU users only. And you know, the future may show us some other agreements, but so far that's our plan on that.
So we're just 2 minutes before the top of the hour.
All right, I think this is a good time for more questions if there are some.
So there are a couple thrown out. Bill had asked earlier about encryption on the tape and the, you know, maybe the impact that has on that second copy access.
So we do have the ability to add encryption to the tape if we want. For the most part, that's not the scope of the data that we're storing, though. So we talked a little bit about the HIPAA data is something that would probably require encryption at rest. And in that case, we wouldn't be doing export for mailing. So hopefully there are two different non-overlapping use cases here, the encryption and the exporting.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think with respect to sort of the encryption that's built into the tape system versus shipping LTFS copies to the users are only going to be shipped non-regulated data, because we're only allowing at least the non-OU users, the ones who would be shipped their cartridges, we're only allowing them to use OURStore for non-regulated data. As a result of that, if they do want encryption, and they may have a legitimate reason for it, it would be software level encryption that they would be managing, and they would be the ones responsible for the encryption key or passcode or whatever, not us. We are not going to run an encryption key escrow service or anything along those lines for non-OU users. And for OU users, remember that the secondary copies don't get shipped. We just hang on to them on campus.
So maybe somewhat indirect is then Bill's follow-on question of, do we need a federated Globus system in order to use the storage?
Not even slightly. We use Globus. You would want Globus on your end if you're using Globus to do the file transfers in either direction, and we will definitely support that. We already support that on the PetaStore. That does not require a federated Globus system. That's just the Globus software to execute the copy. But if you'd prefer to do SCP or SFTP or what have you, you can do that instead. The same will be true on OURStore, but from within OURStore, if you're one of the file owners within OURStore, then you will have the Globus file share capability where you do some clicks with your mouse, and you can designate a file to be shared to specific users, to specific groups of users, or even to the whole world, whether they have a login to OURStore or not. Globus, the premium version of Globus that the institution has to pay for supports that kind of file sharing.
So Bill gave a clarification back to the encryption. So he's asking if you would encourage users to encrypt their data before putting it onto the OURStore if encryption is a concern.
I'm going to change, right. So I'm going to change the order of the words in that sentence. For a non-OU user who wants their non-regulated data to be encrypted, we would encourage them to encrypt that data themselves at home, because if they need to fall back to the secondary copy, they'll need to decrypt it at home.
Right.
Similarly, we've encouraged our users to do compression and tarring, for example, at home, even though the hardware can do that for them. It's more of a long-term approach to archiving that way.
Right.
So there was another independent question about any roadmap to include other tape libraries from other universities in the project.
I'll be honest and say I'm only aware of the following other universities that have institution scale tape archives similar to what we've been talking about here. There's University of Chicago, there's University of Washington, and there's University of Colorado Boulder. I'm sure there are others that I'm not aware of, but it is by no means common. Do we have any plan or roadmap to have some pool of tape libraries in any integrated way. We have no such plan. If someone were to come to us and propose that and have a plan for how to do that, we would certainly be open to listening.
So that's all the questions in the chat, and we are a couple minutes past. If anybody else has any quick questions they'd like to throw out, unmute yourself or type them in chat, but we really appreciate the time our speakers have put into this presentation. It's been great. Appreciate everybody's attendance and participation in the Google Doc for the notes and the questions and answers. There are linked to slides in the Google Doc already. Henry and Patrick got that to us in advance. So near the top, you'll see a couple links right to the Google folder where they're at.
And thank you all for coming. This was fun for us.
All right. Well, doesn't appear to be any more questions. Yes, thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks, Henry.
Bye-bye, all.
Thanks.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.